I was lying in that sterile hospital bed with tubes running out of my arms when my daughter-in-law Melissa leaned close and whispered those two words that would change everything. "Sign it." Her breath smelled like coffee and something else, something sharp like desperation or greed, and her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the clipboard she was holding just inches from my face. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and I could hear the heart monitor beeping steadily beside me, that annoying rhythm that had been my constant companion for 3 days since the stroke hit me during my morning walk. Melissa's smile was wide and bright, the kind of smile she always wore when my son Marcus was around, but he wasn't in the room right then because she'd sent him to get lunch from the cafeteria downstairs, told him I'd specifically requested that chicken sandwich from the place 2 blocks away, which was a lie, but Marcus wouldn't know that. The papers on the clipboard were dense with legal language, the kind that makes your eyes glaze over even when you're healthy, and here I was with half my face still drooping and my words coming out slurred like I'd had too much wine at dinner. She kept pointing at the signature line with one of those nails, painted a deep red that looked almost black in the harsh hospital lighting. "This is just to make things easier," she said in that syrupy voice she used whenever she wanted something, "just so Marcus doesn't have to worry about all the financial stuff while you're recovering." Her hand was on my shoulder now, squeezing just a little too hard, and she had that clipboard tilted so I couldn't quite read all the words even if my vision hadn't been blurry from the medication they'd been pumping into me. I'd never particularly liked Melissa even before this moment, if I'm being honest with myself. She'd come into Marcus's life 5 years ago at some corporate mixer, all glossy hair and designer clothes that cost more than my first car, and she'd latched onto my boy like she'd found a winning lottery ticket. Marcus was a good man, successful in his tech career, owned a beautiful house in the suburbs, and he'd inherited his father's trusting nature. God rest his soul. My husband died 10 years back and left me comfortable, not wealthy by any means, but comfortable enough with the house paid off and a decent retirement account and some investments that had done well over the years. Melissa had shown interest in those investments from the very first family dinner, asking pointed questions about property values and stock portfolios while picking at her salad. The wedding had been extravagant, far more than Marcus and I thought necessary, but Melissa had insisted and my son wanted to make her happy. I'd footed the bill for half of it because that's what you do for your only child, even when the bride's mother spent the entire reception complaining that the champagne wasn't French enough. After the wedding, Melissa had started dropping hints about me updating my will, making sure everything was in order, saying how terrible it would be if something happened and things got complicated. I'd smiled and nodded and ignored her because I'd already had my affairs in order since my husband passed, everything arranged neatly with my lawyer Robert, who'd been handling our family's legal matters for 30 years. But now here she was in this hospital room with these papers and that whisper, "Sign it," like we were conspirators in some plot instead of family members during a health crisis. My right hand was shaky, the one that wasn't affected by the stroke, but she was already pressing a pen into my palm, wrapping my fingers around it like I was a child learning to write for the first time. The door was closed, and I realized she'd done that deliberately, closed it when she sent Marcus away, and the nurse who'd been checking on me every 20 minutes hadn't been by in a while. Time seemed strange in hospitals anyway, stretching and compressing, but something in my gut told me this moment was important, that what I did next would matter more than I could fully understand with my stroke-addled brain. I let the pen drop from my fingers, and it clattered onto the tile floor, rolling under the bed. Melissa's smile flickered for just a second, a crack in that perfect facade, and then she was bending down to retrieve it, and while she was down there I pressed the call button for the nurse. The smile was completely gone when she straightened up, replaced by something harder, something calculating. She started to say something, but the nurse came in, a kind woman named Patricia who'd been taking excellent care of me, and Melissa's face transformed again, all sunshine and concern. She tucked the clipboard under her arm and told Patricia she was just helping me with some paperwork, nothing urgent, and Patricia nodded, but there was something in her eyes that made me think she understood more than she was letting on. After Patricia left, Melissa tried again, but I shook my head, the movement making the room spin slightly. I managed to say no, just that one word, but it came out clear enough. Her jaw tightened and she stood there for a long moment before finally saying we'd talk about it later, when I was feeling better, and she left the room just as Marcus came back with that chicken sandwich I'd never asked for. He was so cheerful, so worried about me, asking if I needed anything, if the doctors had said anything new, and I wanted to tell him what had just happened, but the words wouldn't come and I wasn't even sure I fully understood it myself. Melissa returned a few minutes later and played the devoted daughter-in-law perfectly, fluffing my pillows and adjusting my blankets, and Marcus beamed at both of us like we were his whole world. That night after they'd gone home, I couldn't sleep despite the medication. The machines beeped and hummed, and through my partially closed door I could hear other patients, other families, other crises unfolding. I kept thinking about those papers, about what they might have said, about the way Melissa had whispered those words like a command she expected me to obey. The next morning, when Dr. Harrison made his rounds, I asked him if anyone had brought me legal documents to sign, and he looked confused, said the hospital policy was that patients recovering from strokes shouldn't make any major decisions for at least 2 weeks, that it was actually posted on the wall in every room. I glanced over, and sure enough, there it was on a laminated poster I'd been too out of it to notice. I was released from the hospital 4 days later with instructions for physical therapy and speech therapy and a long list of medications. Marcus and Melissa picked me up, and Melissa insisted I come stay with them instead of going home alone, said it was the least they could do and she'd already prepared the guest room. I didn't want to, but Marcus looked so hopeful and I was still weak enough that the idea of being alone was frightening, so I agreed. Their house was one of those modern places with too much glass and not enough curtains, everything decorated in shades of white and gray like a furniture showroom. The guest room was on the first floor, which Melissa said was perfect because I wouldn't have to deal with stairs, and she'd set up a little bell on the nightstand in case I needed anything during the night. The first few days were manageable. Marcus worked from home and checked on me constantly, bringing me tea and meals, helping me with the exercises the physical therapist had shown me. Melissa was pleasant enough when he was around, all smiles and concern, but I noticed she never quite looked me in the eye. Then one afternoon, when Marcus had to go into the office for an unavoidable meeting, Melissa came into my room with a folder. She sat in the chair by the window and crossed her legs, and there was something almost casual about the way she opened that folder and pulled out papers that looked very similar to what she tried to show me in the hospital. She said we needed to talk about my finances, about making sure Marcus was protected, about how difficult it would be for him if something happened to me and everything was tied up in probate. She used words like streamline and efficiency and family security, and she had charts printed out showing the value of my house and my retirement accounts, numbers I'd never shared with her, which meant she'd been digging into my private information somehow. I asked her how she got those numbers, and she waved her hand dismissively, said Marcus had mentioned them casually, which I knew was a lie because my son respected privacy and would never share such details. She slid the papers across to me on the little table beside my bed and said all I had to do was sign here and initial here, and everything would be so much simpler. I looked at those papers more carefully this time, now that I wasn't drugged and disoriented in a hospital bed. The language was complex, but the gist was clear enough even to my still recovering brain. She wanted me to add her as a joint owner on my bank accounts, wanted me to sign over power of attorney to her, wanted me to change the deed on my house to include her name. She kept talking about how this was normal for families, how it would protect everyone, but I'd been around long enough to know that when someone pushes this hard for access to your money, protection isn't what they have in mind. I told her I needed to think about it, and she said there wasn't much time to think, that these things needed to be done quickly, and I asked her why the rush if this was really about protection and family. Her mask slipped then, just for a moment. Her voice went cold, and she said I should be grateful they were willing to take care of me at all, that plenty of elderly people end up in nursing homes because their families can't be bothered. The threat was implicit but clear. Sign over control or find yourself warehoused somewhere with strangers changing your bedpans. I felt something harden in my chest, some core of steel I'd forgotten I had, and I told her I wanted to go home to my own house. She laughed, actually laughed, and said I wasn't capable of living alone, that Marcus would never allow it, that I was being stubborn and ungrateful. I asked her to leave my room, and she stood up slowly, gathering her papers, and said we'd continue this conversation later whether I liked it or not. That evening I waited until Marcus came home, and I asked to speak with him privately. We went out onto their back patio, one of those spaces with expensive outdoor furniture and a built-in grill that probably cost more than my first house. I told him I wanted to go home, and he looked genuinely distressed, said he was worried about me being alone, and I could see the conflict in his face because he wanted to trust his wife, but he also wanted to respect his mother. I didn't tell him about the papers or Melissa's threats, not yet, because I needed to be sure of what was happening before I blew up his marriage. Instead, I compromised, said I'd stay another week, but then I needed to be in my own space, and he reluctantly agreed. The next morning, I called my lawyer Robert from the guest room phone while Melissa was out at her yoga class. I told him everything about the hospital, about the papers, about the financial information Melissa somehow had access to. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Robert said something that made my blood run cold. He told me that 2 weeks before my stroke, someone claiming to be me had called his office asking about the procedures for changing beneficiaries and adding joint account holders. His assistant had found it odd because the voice didn't quite sound right, so they'd insisted on an in-person meeting before proceeding with anything, and then the caller had hung up and never followed up. Robert had meant to mention it to me, but I'd had the stroke before our next scheduled meeting. I felt sick. Melissa had been planning this, had been working toward this for who knows how long. I asked Robert what I should do, and he said first thing was to make absolutely certain all my accounts and documents were secure, that no one had managed to make any changes without my knowledge. He said he'd do a full audit of everything, check with the banks, verify all the paperwork, and he'd get back to me within 48 hours. He also suggested I might want to consider installing some security measures, maybe recording conversations, documenting everything, because if this went where he thought it might go, I'd need evidence. Those 48 hours were the longest of my life. I played the role of recovering invalid, letting Melissa fuss over me when Marcus was around, accepting her help with meals and medications. But I watched her now with new eyes, saw the calculation behind every gesture, noticed how she always positioned herself between me and Marcus during conversations, how she controlled the flow of information in the house. I also noticed she went through my purse one afternoon when she thought I was napping, and I lay there with my eyes barely cracked open, watching her photograph my driver's license and insurance cards with her phone. Robert called back on day 3 with news that was both relieving and terrifying. All my accounts were still secure, nothing had been changed, but he discovered that someone had attempted to access my credit report using my social security number. The attempt had been flagged and denied, but it had happened just 2 days before my stroke. He'd also found out that Melissa had been researching estate planning attorneys in the area, specifically ones who specialized in what he delicately called aggressive wealth transfer strategies. He said we needed to act quickly to protect my assets, and he had a plan if I was willing to go along with it. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Robert would draw up a new will and power of attorney documents, ones that specifically excluded Melissa and included very clear language about my wishes. But more than that, he'd create what he called a living trust, transferring all my assets into it with me as the trustee and Marcus as the successor trustee, but only after my death and only with provisions that prevented any spouse of his from having access or control. It would be ironclad, reviewed by 3 other attorneys, and filed in such a way that any attempt to contest it would trigger additional protections. But here was the clever part. We wouldn't tell anyone about it immediately. Instead, Robert would prepare a fake set of documents, ones that appeared to give Melissa what she wanted, and we'd see what she did with them. I struggled with the ethics of this deception, but Robert reminded me that Melissa had been deceiving me for who knows how long, had possibly contributed to the stress that caused my stroke with her constant pressure and manipulation. He said sometimes you had to fight fire with fire, and this was the best way to protect both my assets and my son from a predator in designer clothes. I agreed, and 2 days later Robert came to the house with his assistant, supposedly for a routine check-in about my estate. Melissa was hovering, of course, trying to be part of the meeting, but Robert insisted on attorney-client privilege and Marcus backed him up, taking Melissa out to run errands while we talked. Robert had me sign the real documents first, the ones that truly protected everything. His assistant notarized them, and they were sealed and filed before Melissa and Marcus even got home. Then Robert left the fake documents on the guest room desk, casually, like they were drafts he'd forgotten. The fake papers showed exactly what Melissa wanted: joint accounts, power of attorney in her name, simplified transfer of assets. I felt like I was setting a trap for a wild animal, and I suppose in a way I was. It took less than 6 hours. That evening after dinner, Marcus went upstairs to his home office to take a work call, and Melissa said she'd